Hi, I'm Dr. Martin, and this is Words of Life podcast. We are in a series on Judges. This is the second of our series on the book of Judges, doing a Bible study in chapter 1. And I teach at the Pentecostal Theological Seminary in Cleveland, Tennessee, teach Old Testament and biblical languages. And I've invited Dr. Basdeo Hill to come and study with me through the book of Judges, because she's right now teaching a course on the book of Judges here at the seminary. If you'd like to follow along with our lessons, you can get my book, Clothed with the Spirit, Lessons from the Book of Judges, on Amazon.com and follow along, although we will be saying some things that are also not necessarily in the book. Well, we're glad that you joining us today, and we will be diving right in. And so I'm going to ask Dr. Hill, if she would, to read from the book of Judges, the first few verses, perhaps.
We left off at verse 2 last time. Do you want me to read?
So just start back at verse 1.
Okay.
And read through, how far should we go? Verse 7? Yeah,
Sure.
That'd be a good place to go.
So read all those verses.
Right.
Okay, so we're reading from verse 1. Now, after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, Who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites, to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Indeed, I have delivered the land into his hand. So Judah said to Simeon his brother, Come up with me to my allotted territory, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I will likewise go with you to your allotted territory. And Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand. And they killed 10,000 men at Bezek, and they found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek, and fought against him. And they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Then Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to gather scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. Then they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died.
Okay, so in response to Israel's inquiry, they asked God who would be their leader. God names Judah as the tribe of preeminence, which is suggestive in at least two ways, which we discussed last time. First, the naming of a tribe, Judah, rather than an individual as a leader, introduces a new structure of leadership. Up until now, a single person had been the leader, but now a tribe is called the leader. Joshua's death then was followed by a new model of leadership, tribal leadership. They no longer followed a single national leader, but each tribe was led by elders and judges. The office of judge is where we get the title for the book of Judges. The judges were a group of people instituted by Moses as a means of mediating between parties in conflict over the law, over the Torah, the law of Moses. You can find the institution of the judges in Exodus chapter 18 and Deuteronomy chapter 16. These judges were responsible to maintain justice among the people, but in the book of Judges, these responsibilities are expanded to include leadership in battle. Another element that comes forth here in the choosing of Judah is the undergirding of the later choice of David as the ideal king. David is from the tribe of Judah, and throughout the book of Judges, the tribe of Judah is depicted as the most faithful of the tribes of Israel, and Judah's exemplary behavior is evident here in his cooperation between Judah and Simeon. Judah's invitation to Simeon is reasonable in light of Joshua chapter 19 that points out that Simeon's territory was actually within the boundaries of Judah. So they were, the lands of Judah and Simeon were side by side, conjoined there. So they are working together, which is an admirable quality. These next few verses, up through verse 18, detail a number of victories that Judah wins. Judah and Simeon join together, and the next 17 verses are devoted to their battles, and they defeat numerous enemies and claim new cities. They conquer Bezek, Jerusalem, Hebron, Hormah, Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron, and Caleb takes Kirjath Sefer. So we're going to go back and take a look at some of these victories. I'm going to read a few more verses, and then Dr. Hill, would you want to say something about Adonai Bezek?
Sure.
Let's see, what's after that? You have Jerusalem, and you have Caleb and Caleb's daughter, Aksah. Dr. Hill wrote an academic paper that she presented at a conference on Aksah, and so we want her to be sure and talk about that. So just to remind you, verse 4 said that Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and Perizzites. They killed 10,000 men at Bezek, and they found Adonai Bezek, and he was the king. They defeated him, and they cut off his thumbs and big toes. So what can we learn from that, Dr. Hill?
Well, one, in Exodus, I believed the people, God commanded the people not to mutilate their enemies. So even though war was a part of the ancient culture, God did not want his people to act like the surrounding nations. They had to be different. But here we see Israel's first failure. I believe they acted like the Canaanites, because Adoni or Adonai Bezek, he said that he implied that he also cut off the thumbs and big toes of 70 kings, and these 70 kings have used to gather scraps under his table. So here we have the people of God acting like the enemy, which God explicitly commanded them not to behave.
Right. So they brought him to Jerusalem. The Israelites were commanded to kill the enemy, but they thought it was advisable to capture him and keep him as a prisoner, kind of as a trophy. But that was not what God had commanded them to do. So even though they won the battle, they're acting in a way that is not exactly what God told them to do. So that hints at the fact that they're beginning to disobey God. The next few verses talk about more victories of Judah, which leads us then down to Caleb, one of the great heroes of the Bible, from the book of Numbers, chapters 13 and 14. And here in verse 12, let's read verse 12. Then Caleb said, "Whoever attacks Kirjath Sefer and takes it, to him I will give my daughter Aksah as wife." And Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So he gave him his daughter Aksah as a wife. Now it happened that when she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said, "What do you wish?" So she said to him, "Give me a blessing. Since you have given me the land in the south, give me also springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. So we'll ask Dr. Hill to share a few thoughts about this amazing woman, Aksa, here at the beginning of the book of Judges.
So, what's interesting about the book of Judges is that it is filled with stories of male heroes, right? And we often celebrate these male heroes, and we even preach about these male heroes. So, the most famous or well known judges in the book of Judges are Gideon and Samson. So, I'm sure if you've grown up in the church, you have heard a lesson or a sermon preached about these two men. But in this book that is filled with several male heroes, we also have several notable women, and their stories are throughout the book of Judges, and we often overlook their stories. Perhaps the most well-known woman in the book of Judges is Deborah herself. And so Dr. Martin, he had written his thesis, his doctoral thesis on the book of Judges, and he focused on hearing Yahweh, the people of Israel hearing Yahweh, and then their failure to hear Yahweh and the consequences of failing to hear Yahweh or obey Yahweh, because the Hebrew word shama, which means to hear, also means to obey. So I picked up on that as I read the book of Judges, and as I noticed the stories of the women, I realized that as Israel failed to obey God, the treatment of women declined. And so in the paper that Dr. Martin referenced, I demonstrated how the stories of these women, the treatment of these stories declined as Israel failed to obey God. So the very first woman we encounter in the book of Judges is Aksa. And again, Aksa is easily overlooked. One, because she is, her story is found between it's in the midst of all of these stories about conquest. So we tend to focus on Israel conquering the land, defeating the enemies, or their failure to conquer the land. She's also perhaps overshadowed by her well-known father, Caleb. As you know, Caleb was one of Joshua's leaders there. He was one of the spies that went into the promised land, and he came back with a good report. And he encouraged the people to go ahead and possess the land, but the people rejected Caleb's advice. So, she's overshadowed by her powerful, well-known father. Her husband, Othniel, who ends up being a judge, the first judge in the book of Judges, she's also perhaps overshadowed by him. But Aksa's story shows us that she is not just a trophy wife, because we find out at the very beginning, the verses that Dr. Martin read, that Caleb offered her up as a prize to the man who would defeat or go against the enemy. And so whoever conquered the enemy, then Aksa would be given as that individual's prize. But she doesn't just, while the story begins with her being a trophy wife, it doesn't end with her just being a pliant or submissive trophy wife. In fact, the story, these few verses, show us that Aksa is assertive, she is shrewd, she's intelligent, she has foresight, she even has a voice, and she is named. Now, the fact that she has a name and she has a voice is significant to the book of Judges, because as the book progresses, Dr. Martin, as you know, women are not named and they don't have a voice anymore, so they don't speak anymore. But here, Aksa, the first woman who functions as the paradigmatic woman, she is named, she has a voice, and she acts assertively. And so how does she act independently and assertively? Well, she realizes in the ancient culture that the people must have a well irrigated land, land that has a good supply of water. And so she asks her husband or she urged her husband to ask her father for land with water. But it seems like Othniel does not ask Caleb for the land. And so Achsah takes matters into her own hands, and she goes to Caleb herself, and she says to him, give me this land with water. And what's significant here, the words give me is an imperative, it's a command. And it's the same imperative that Caleb uses when he insists that Joshua give him the land of Hebron. And we see this, for example, in Joshua 14 and 12. So Achsah, therefore, acts not as a submissive trophy wife, but she acts authoritatively, and she takes charge of her family's future, and she speaks and acts in the same manner as her father Caleb. She acts as a man would act in that day and time. And so Caleb is known early in the canon as a man of great faith who had another spirit. And so Achsah is acting in the same manner as Caleb, who has with that same spirit. So when we come to the end of the narrative, so that's Achsah's narrative, we realize that she is decisive, she's commanding, and she's pragmatic. Achsah's confident request for better land was granted. And since, as I mentioned earlier, she is the first woman mentioned in the book of Judges, she therefore functions as the paradigmatic woman. She is named, she acts, she speaks, and her demand is met. Although her story is bracketed by Israel's continued conquest for Canaan, when we encounter Achsah, Israel's moral and spiritual decline have not yet been mentioned in the narrative. So Judges begins with Israel's inquiring or asking Yahweh who will go up, right, for them, and their subsequent hearing and obeying of Yahweh. They do allow Judah to go up for them, so they obey Yahweh's command or instructions. So Achsah's story therefore hints that when Israel is obedient to Yahweh, women are provided the same voice, respect, and opportunities as their fathers and husbands. But as the narrative continues, Yahweh soon accuses Israel of not hearing or obeying him. And so as Israel fails to hear Yahweh, we see therefore the treatment of women decline, and women suffer horrific violence by the end of the book.
Oh, that's great. A great exposition of this passage. I have a couple of questions for you, just to refresh everybody's memory of, I guess, of some of the main points you mentioned. The first thing that struck me was in a story of all these battles, one battle after another, you have it interrupted. All the battles are interrupted by a woman asking or demanding, really, her father to give her land. It just seems so out of place. The fact that Achsah is her story comes in the middle of a list of battles suggests to me that it must be very emphatic.
Yeah, definitely. Because I believe this story is here intentionally to show us how women are treated in the book or in Israel at the time. They are treated differently from their surrounding, or expected to be treated differently from those who are from the women in other nations. And so I think it's here to show us, as you said, it's emphatic, to teach us a lesson, to show us that Yahweh's treatment of women, there's a certain standard, and so Israel must follow that standard as well.
Right. Now, it may be stretching things a bit, but it just occurs to me that when she says, give me land with springs, that she's talking about prosperity, flourishing, talking about fruitfulness, which reminds me of the original promise God gave to the Israelites that he would lead them into a land flowing with milk and honey. And so it seems like her request could be even thought of as symbolizing Israel's request to God for a fruitful land, and God's promise of a fruitful land. God doesn't intend to give the Israelites a place of dry and deserted and fruitless. And so she, in a way, represents. Well, I mean, you could even expand it to say that Aksah's request to Caleb, who was a man in authority, is much like our request to God for a place. Everybody wants a place. We need a place to belong, a land. We belong, of course, in God's family, and we want to belong. We want to have a place. We want to be fruitful. We want to be prosperous. We don't want to just subsist in a dry desert land. And so I don't want to stretch it into becoming allegorical or anything like that. But the thing about the Old Testament that I think is important we remember is that it's focused on realities. That to them the blessing of God was the land. The land was the blessing. For Christians, we think about spiritual blessings, but that's and of course there are spiritual blessings in the Old Testament too, but the blessings of God were more tied to the land. We don't think of blessings being tied to the land, but in the Old Testament, it's a very physical kind of environment, and so her request or her demand for land with springs is a reflection of her belief that she desires and should have a place that is livable. And isn't that really what all of us, in the end, what we all want?
Right. And just to pick up on what you said, the fact that, the land, God promised a land flowing with milk and honey. So when I was a kid, I'm not sure how you thought about it, what image came to your mind, but I literally thought when I heard this story about the land flowing with milk and honey that there were actual rivers flowing with milk and honey,
yeah,
right? But that's not what it means.
No.
It's just a metaphor for the abundance and the prosperity of the land. And the fact that this woman wants part of that abundance and prosperity, and she was given the land, shows that even God's intentions for prosperity and abundance and the gift of the land is for women as well, not just for the men.
Right. And then the other really, among many points you made, but one other really important point is that her positive portrayal and her father's positive treatment of her here in the narrative in chapter 1 shows that women seem to have been more respected and well treated than they were at the end of the book of Judges.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the end of the book of Judges concludes with some very, very, very bad, immoral, horrific treatment of women. And so the decline of the treatment of the weaker people in society seems to correspond with the decline of spirituality and obedience to God. So thank you very much for explaining all that to us. So I guess we can move on to the next section, beginning with verse 19. Let me read a few verses, and if you have any thoughts, you can jump in, Dr. Hill. Starting with verse 19. So the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland, because they had chariots of iron. And they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he expelled from there the 3 sons of Anak, which were considered to be giants. But the children of Benjamin did not, notice this, verse 21, the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. And the house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. So the house of Joseph sent men to spy out Bethel. The name of the city was formerly Luz. And when the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, "Please show us the entrance to the city, and we will show you mercy." So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites, built a city, and called its name Luz, which is its name to this day. So this tells us some more about how the Israelites are beginning to fail, beginning to disobey God. I don't know what to make of verse 19. They could not drive out the inhabitants because they had chariots of iron. So it says the Lord was with Judah, but they could not defeat the chariots of iron. So I think this verse is probably there to make us begin to wonder what's going on. And the chariots of iron will be brought up again in chapter 4 when Deborah leads the battle, and they do defeat the iron chariots. So the fact that Judah could not win this battle probably suggests that they were giving in or giving up. It doesn't say that. It says they could not win the battle because of the iron chariots. But, we're kind of reading between the lines there. Why couldn't they, if God was with them, why couldn't they do that? We either have to blame God or blame Judah. And I think I'll blame Judah because I know God has the power to defeat. But somewhere Judah is beginning to wane in their efforts.
Is it possible? Because I'm probably reading into the lines too much in between the lines, but is it possible because they started acting like the Canaanites? So the fact that they disobeyed God's command concerning the enemy, the capture of Adonai Bezek, that they were unsuccessful here.
Right, could be. Yeah, that's a good thought. But whether it is or not, I think this verse at least makes us begin to ask those questions.
Right.
And so we're asking those questions, and we're wondering, wait a minute, why are they not winning this battle? What's going on? Something is wrong here.